So what did he do after the war? Well, in 1786, Cornwallis accepted appointment as Governor General and Commander-in-Chief of the presidency of Fort William, which is now in India, with a military command as well. Cornwallis engaged in reforms of all types. He also enacted important reforms in the operations of the British East India Company, and with the notable exception of Mysore, managed to keep Great Britain out of wars during his tenure. Is that even possible for Great Britain not to be colonizing somewhere? So before Cornwallis's tenure, company employees were allowed to trade on their own accounts and use British ships to send their own goods back to Europe. Cornwallis eliminated the practice, increasing employee salaries and compensation. He also worked to reduce nepotism and political favoritism, instituting the practice of merit-based advancement. Cornwallis had the company take over the few remaining judicial powers of the Nawab of Bengal and gave some judicial powers to company employees. In 1790, he introduced circuit courts with company employees as judges and set up a court in Calcutta. He had the legal frameworks of company of Muslim and Hindu law translated into English and made a new civil and criminal code, and this work, introduced in 1793, was known as the Cornwallis Code. Now, one consequence of the code was that it instituted a type of racism, placing the British as the upper class. Wow, who could have seen that coming? On top of the complex hierarchy of caste and religion that already existed in India at the time. Now, Cornwallis's attitude towards the lower class did, however, include a desire to improve their conditions, most notably by giving them tea. And he introduced legislation to protect native weavers who were sometimes forced into working at starvation wages by unscrupulous company employees. He outlawed child slavery and established in 1791 a Sanskrit college for Hindus in Varanasi. Now, the good thing is we know that companies would never, ever, ever use child slaves in Bangladesh ever again. He also established a mint in Calcutta that benefited the poor by providing a reliable standard currency. Part of the Cornwallis Code was an important land taxation reform known in the presidency of Fort William as the Permanent Settlement. This reform permanently altered the way Great Britain collected taxes in its territories by taxing landowners based on the value of their land and not necessarily the value of its produce. Now, Cornwallis had been sent to the presidency of Fort William with instructions to avoid conflict with Great Britain's neighbors. Early in his tenure, he ended agreements with the Maratha Empire and Hyderabad that he saw as violating the 1784 Treaty of Bangalore that ended the Second Anglo-Mysore War. This ensured Great Britain's non-involvement in the Maratha-Mysore War. He was, however, maneuvered into the establishment of a new British base at Penang, where conflict was avoided when he agreed to pay money to the local ruler for use of the base. Great Britain was unavoidably drawn into war with Mysore in 1790. Tipu Sultan, the Sultan of Mysore, that's why he's called Tipu Sultan, expressed a desire to renew war with Great Britain, which I don't know why you'd be attacking the British. It's not like that went well. But anyway, in 1789, he invaded Travancore, a British ally, according to that treaty. And because of territorial disputes and Travancore's harboring of refugees from other Mysorean wars, Cornwallis ordered British troops to mobilize in response. The 1790 campaign against Tipu was conducted by General William Meadows, and it was a limited success. Meadows successfully occupied Coimbatore, but Tipu counterattacked and was able to reduce the British position to a small number of strongly held outposts. Tipu then invaded the Carnatic region, where he attempted unsuccessfully to draw France into the conflict, but then being Because of Meadows' weak campaigning, Cornwallis personally took command of the British forces in 1791. When the war broke out, Cornwallis negotiated alliances with the Maratha Empire and Hyderabad. After successfully besieging Bangalore, Cornwallis then joined forces with Hyderabadi forces. These forces then marched toward the Mysorean capital at Seringapatam, compelling Tipu to retreat into the city at the Battle of Arakere on May 15th. Dwindling provisions exacerbated by Tipu's slash-and-burn tactics forced Cornwallis to abandon the idea of besieging Seringapatam that season, so he retreated to Bangalore. In January 1792, the army set out for Seringapatam. Arriving before the city on February 5th, Cornwallis quickly eliminated Tipu's defensive positions outside the city, and then began the siege operations. Tipu requested negotiations on February 23rd, and peace was agreed on March 18th. Cornwallis and his allies demanded half of Mysore's territory, much of which went to the Allies. And when he returned to Britain in 1794, he found that Britain was engaged in the War of the First Coalition against France. After he was sent on a fruitless diplomatic mission to stop the fighting, he was appointed Master of the Ordnance, a post he held until 1798. Now, what this meant is that he was responsible for much of the British Army's military infrastructure, overseeing its storage depots and supply infrastructure, as well as commanding its artillery and engineering forces, which seems like a pretty boring job for me. But anyways, I mean, this guy probably got paid well. So he oversaw improvements to British coastal defenses and was able to expand Woolwich Academy's artillery training program. In June 1798, he was appointed Lord Lieutenant and Commander-in-Chief of Ireland. His appointment was made in response to the outbreak in late May of the Irish Rebellion of 1798. His appointment was greeted unfavorably by the Irish elite, who preferred his predecessor John Pratt, 1st Marquess Camden, and suspected that he had liberal sympathies with many of the Catholic rebels. In his command role as both Lord Lieutenant and Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Army, Cornwallis oversaw the defeat of both the Irish rebels and a French invasion force led by General Jean-Joseph Aimable Humbert that landed in Connacht in August 1798, but right away was defeated and forced to surrender at the Battle of Ballinamuck, which was the last time France surrendered. During the autumn, Cornwallis secured government control over most of the island and organized the suppression of the remaining supporters of the United Irish movement. Now, Cornwallis was instrumental in securing passage in 1800 of the Act of Union by the Parliament of Ireland, a necessary step in the creation of the United Kingdom. Although Cornwallis recognized that the union with Ireland was unlikely to succeed without Catholic emancipation, he and William Pitt, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, were unable to move George III of the United Kingdom, who was King of Great Britain, Ireland, Elector of Hanover, and Duke of Brunswick-Luneburg, on the subject. So Cornwallis resigned and returned to London in May 1801. Now, expecting an opportunity to relax at home, Cornwallis was instead dispatched not long after his return to take command of Eastern District, with orders to lead the defenses of Eastern Britain against a threatened French invasion. Cornwallis was sent to France to finalize peace terms with Napoleon, the first consul of France. The peace negotiations were made possible in Great Britain by financial pressure brought on by the ongoing wars and by Napoleon's desire to consolidate his hold in Europe. Pitt's resignation brought Henry Addington, 1st Viscount Sidmouth, to power as the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he appointed Cornwallis as plenipotentiary minister to France, which is just a fancy way of saying diplomat. The negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Amiens, which Cornwallis signed on behalf of the United Kingdom on March 25, 1802. This treaty ended the War of the Second Coalition, but the peace was short-lived. Actions by Napoleon of the next year alarmed the other European powers, and the United Kingdom refused to withdraw forces from Malta as specified in the treaty. By May 1803, war was again declared in the War of the Third Coalition. Now in 1805, Cornwallis was reappointed Governor-General in the presidency of Fort William by Pitt, who had again become Prime Minister, this time to curb the expansionist activity of Richard Wellesley, 1st Marquess Wellesley, and he's the brother of the Duke of Wellington, for those of you who don't know. He arrived in India in July 1805, but died on October 5th of a fever at Gauspur, now Ghazipur in India. Now, you might be wondering, why is he even on this list? After all, he seemed to basically just be a guy who kind of lost the American Revolution, created the United Kingdom, and ended the War of the Second Coalition. So isn't he, I guess, either a medium or good guy? Well, no. And the reason he isn't is because he was the Governor General of the presidency of Fort William. So you might be wondering, so what? Well, during his time as Governor General of India, there was a famine that broke out, which, for those of you who've watched my old videos, you know where this is going. But during this famine, there were over 11 million people who died. And so now you might be wondering, why did I talk about it? Well, that's because I made an entire video about famines like that, and I'm not going to waste any more time since this video is already super long. So if you want to learn more about that famine, go watch that. Anyways, the reason he's there is because he is responsible for the deaths of over 11 million. But once again, as I said, if you want to know the details, watch that video. Now, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you sometime in the future, which probably means like a month. But anyways, see you later.